I don't know how I could add anything to the words that we've shared so far this morning.
Amen.
The grace that we have to be called children of God. That the one who created all the universe, stars that are so far away that and yet he cares down to the very hairs of our head. And he calls each of us to be in relationship directly with him. We don't have to go through some chain of command to reach God. What grace. We're continuing on in 1 Corinthians. I seem to be going up and down. I don't know how much of it is under your control, Don, or not, with the volume. We talked some last week about what it was like in Corinth and kind of what Paul was trying to address with this church. What was it that he was really concerned about? We just kind of started setting some of that groundwork for us to dig a little deeper in. This week I really want us to dig into chapters 3 and 4. And before we get there, this idea that the way we think about things does come out. And it comes out in the way that we say things. Our words can betray us. I wasn't just teasing Amy. You've heard some people say things that make you go, that make your eyes do that, right? I know you like that picture. I did this picture back when we were overseas, and then Mark took it and just did all kind of stuff with it. So I knew he would like it. But you've heard people say things and you're like, I can't believe they said that. You've got to be kidding, right? But that's what our words do. They betray what's really going on inside. They betray the way that we see other people, the secret judgments that we make about them, the way that we view the world, the way we even think about God. It comes out in the way that we talk. And the Corinthian church was no different. So this whole thing that was going on there in the beginning, where some of them saying, well, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, and I am of Christ. This whole party mentality that was going on, it reveals some things going on in their ways of thinking. What is Christianity? And Paul writes in the beginning of chapter 3 that he says, when I wrote to you, I couldn't address you as spiritual because you weren't. I had to treat you like babies, people that were still really caught up in the life of the flesh, not spiritually minded. Because, and he says right there, verse 4, when one of you says, I am a follower of Paul, and another says, I prefer Apollos, aren't you acting like those who are not Christians? That's how the NLT translates it. Or you might get a more literal, aren't you acting like mere men? People that don't have the Spirit in them. People that are not living with that framework going in and washing through everything that they think about. How does the life happen? If we're just thinking on that merely human level, then we're going to fall into this kind of thinking. And what do we mean by this kind of thinking? Well, let's dig a little deeper. Okay? If you're thinking about church as how you do what you do, okay? Oh, good. Thank you for keeping me on track. We want to go back, before we dig into what is this kind of thinking, let's go back and just review about first century Corinth. There's this whole thing that we see in chapter 11 about the social climbing and kind of showing off wealth. That's what was going on in chapter 11. The rich people were bringing this big feast with them to the fellowship meal, and then they were going on and eating it and drinking so much that they were drunk before the slaves even got off work to come and partake, and there was nothing for them to eat. Well, that was just part of what was going on in Corinth. Have we ever seen anything like that in our own culture? I think it's called conspicuous consumption. People that may not even have adequate food or education, but they're going to make sure they've got those Air Jordans. I know that example's a little dated, but I'm not sure what the most current thing is. We've seen that, right? People that drive this really fancy car even though they live in a shack because that's what's important to the people in their circle. Or whatever the example is, you could multiply it by 1,000 different examples where people are doing something to be seen by others, and that thing is to elevate them in the standing of their peers. Wealthy, showing off, whatever it is. That's a human perspective. That is not of the Spirit. So, also this thing going on in Corinth that we talked about, that they had the philosopher Diogenes who kind of started the Cynic philosophy, but there were all these other philosophers, and everyone was trying to gain a following, and that's how you made money, was the more followers you had. Sounds kind of like social media. Well, they had their social media back then. It just wasn't electronic. So, all these different philosophers in this competing for audience, competing for status, that was tied in. That was part and parcel of culture in Corinth and throughout the Roman world. Then this whole thing about being addicted to sensory experience. Might be in, variety and special things in food, or it might be about massage. It might be about visiting the temple and those people that work at the temple and making sure you enjoy yourself while you're there, or any number of other things. We see it taking place in the church in Corinth because of the way that they are getting into this sensory experience of speaking in tongues. And so that they put that ahead of actually accomplishing something of getting the word across to people. They're addicted to this sensory experience. We see that in modern American churches with the way that they're addicted to the music. And if it doesn't come across in the style and the volume that they like, or the preaching or the drama or whatever it is, thinking at that merely human level, and this whole tit-for-tat worldview. Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, including God. Okay, God, you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And, something bad happened to me, I must have done something that God didn't like. That's this tit-for-tat worldview, or some people call it karma. That's what it's about. And all of this is underlay by this way of thinking that we want to talk about. So, when church is something that you do, is the shirt rubbing? Is that part of what's going on? Yep. Let's see if we can. I think I'll hold it. No? It's very sensitive, but it's also very directional. We'll see what we can do. Is that better? There, finally. Felt like I was in a cave. When church is something that you do, well, then it becomes a zero-sum game. When you have a zero-sum game, that means if one party wins, the other has to lose. Because you get, if one is +1, the other one has to be -1. When you add them together, 0. So, one guy gets the ice cream, what's going on with the other one? None for me. So, how do you deal with that? You fight. You take. Because after all, it's a dog-eat-dog world, right? That's the only way you're going to get anywhere. If there is no God of plenty, if there is no God of abundance, if there is no higher power looking to bless me, then you got to take matters into your own hands. So, take. Well, then you get the whole reversal. It's a zero-sum game. When church is about what you do, when it's about appearances, when it is about all these ways that we as humans measure success, then it becomes a zero-sum game. One of our good friends that's still there in Rwanda, he and his wife were at the same church where Anne-Laure and I were when we were working on our masters in Memphis. And then they went and served in Western Africa, in the countries where voodoo came from. And then when they finished there, then they moved on to Rwanda. So he was writing some about this foundation for idolatry and the way that thinking. And it is this worldview that says there is a limited amount of resources. And therefore, if one wins, someone else has to lose. And if you're going to try to be fair, that means everybody's going to be equally miserable. That's all that's possible in that worldview. Maybe you're going to take from the rich and give to the poor. That means everybody's going to be... Nobody is going to have enough that way. And the same if you have taking from the poor and just the rich getting richer and richer and richer. You still have the same problem. Everyone loses in this way of thinking. So, Paul is dealing with this same issue because that's what he means. You're just thinking like normal people. You are not showing that you are born of the Spirit. You are not thinking like someone who is a child of the one true King. So, how do we know that he's dealing with that? Well, right here. Now they were saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ, but we know this today, right? Denominations. Oh yes, we follow Calvin. We adhere to his, or we follow Luther, or we follow, you name whoever it is. That's what a denomination is. When you hold that identity above loyalty to Christ. I mean, does Christ have multiple bodies? Or we could have put another picture up there where you've got a two-headed body. You know, Christ is the nominal head, but then you've got this person that lives right now who is the head of the church. How does that work? So this whole way of thinking where the name, the external appearance, the things that humans consider valuable, that you can measure, then that betrays a way of thinking that is not of the Spirit. So, what is it that he says as we supersede this way of thinking? Chapter 3. Verse 5, who is Apollos? And who is Paul that we should be the cause of such quarrels? Why, we're only servants. Through us, God caused you to believe. Each of us did the work the Lord gave us. My job was to plant the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered it, but it was God, not we, who made it grow. The ones who do the planting or watering aren't important, but God is important because he is the one who makes the seed grow. The one who plants and the one who waters work as a team with the same purpose, yet they will be rewarded individually according to their own work. We work together as partners who belong to God. You are God's field, God's building, not ours. And then down to verse 16. Don't you realize all of you together are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God lives in you? God will bring ruin upon anyone who ruins this temple. For God's temple is holy, and you Christians are that temple. The church, the one church, is not to be parceled up. People staking out territory for their favorite whatever. One church. That is essential in understanding that we are walking by the Spirit. And Paul says, the way you talk about it, the desires that this quarreling going on among you, and that I can't even speak to you like you're real Christians. I'm having to speak to you like people of the world because this betrays what's going on in your mind, the way that you are approaching this Christian life, that you haven't really gotten the gospel, that God has more than enough for everyone. Same for the rich and poor, same for the saint and for the sinner, for the whole wide world, your great grace. So, as we go forward, thinking about this, all this way of thinking where it's a competitive, a zero-sum game, all of it is a way to limit God. It's a way to make him more manageable. So, classic idolatry. People make a statue or some other way that they are personifying God, that they had control over how it appeared and what his characteristics are. And then it becomes a matter of how do we appease him? What are we going to do to make sure that he does what we want back? That's classic idolatry. And it is part of this avoiding a direct connection. The God who made the world. What does Proverbs say is the beginning of wisdom? The fear of the Lord. There is a reason that is true. If we are going to be in a relationship with this true God, not this little man-made one, it is the awesome, terrifying, bone-shaking reality. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Because only when we realize that he is so far above, so much beyond our ability to comprehend, only when we grasp onto that can we abandon this way of thinking where we're going to manage God. So these ways that people avoid a direct connection, it goes back. I mean, this is throughout history. You see it in the idolatry, but just let's look there in Exodus. What is it that the children of Israel did? Here they are at the foot of Mount Sinai. And Moses has already told them, this is how you're going to prepare. And God's going to come down and he's going to speak to you. 20 verse 18. When the people heard the thunder and the loud blast of the horn, and when they saw the lightning and the smoke billowing from the mountain, they stood at a distance, trembling with fear. They said to Moses, You tell us what God says and we'll listen, but don't let God speak directly to us. If he does, we'll die. Keep him at arm's length. This is too much. Verse 20, don't be afraid, Moses said, for God has come in this way to show you his awesome power. And now, from now on, let your fear of him keep you from sinning. We see the same thing because it didn't stop there. It goes on till in Jesus' time, were they really following God? Or had they set Moses up in the place of God? Their own denomination. They had put this favorite leader up there at the top. And they could manipulate what he did, what he said, to their own pleasure that way. So, John chapter 9. They're upset, having this discussion with the man that Jesus has healed. And the man knows Jesus is from God. He is living the direct experience. He has had that direct connection. And they're, because that's too much to consider that God would actually directly touch someone. And verse 27, look, the man exclaimed, I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Woo! They cursed him and said, you are his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. Who's the head? Who is the king? Who is the ruler? Is it God or is it Moses? We are disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know anything about him. Why, that's very strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, yet you don't know anything about him? I mean, God doesn't listen to sinners. He's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Never since the world began has anyone been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't do it. You were born in sin, they answered. You trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. The power of truth to disturb those who are thinking only at this level. Mere human thinking. The wisdom of this world and the wisdom of God seems like foolishness, craziness by comparison. All this work to try to take what is infinite, what is beyond comprehension, and bring it down to a manageable level. That's what religion is. That's what these people in the church in Corinth were doing. Bring it down where they could kind of pick and choose. Where it became more about what they wanted than about what God wanted. And how they might manipulate what they had heard to fit with what they wanted to do. So, we've never seen anybody do that in modern times. So, what is it that we're trying to get this picture of? What is it that Paul says to them to get them out of this way of thinking? Well, we need to look there at the end of chapter 3. And in thinking about this idea of the cross and how offensive it was, you mean this convicted criminal is the one that we're supposed to rely on? We're supposed to be like him? Wait. Paul brings it here at the end of chapter 3. Verse 21. Don't take pride in following a particular leader. Everything belongs to you. Paul, Apollos, Peter, the whole world, life, death, present, the future, everything belongs to you. And you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. If you were a child of the one true King who is over the whole universe, He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, the gold in every mine. Then it's all for his children. He's the one who makes it more than enough. So, Paul immediately wants to deal with the swing, because if he's directed where they've gone this way, he wants to make sure they don't go too far the other way, because it's there already. There's some of them, oh yes, we are children of God. That means we've got this grace, we can do whatever. God's going to forgive us, and just everything's going to be fine because God is on our side. And these people that are suffering, they must have done something really bad. You just don't have enough faith. That's why God hasn't healed you. Paul's ready to deal with that now, chapter 4. Look at Paul and me as mere servants of Christ who have been put in charge of explaining God's secrets. Now, a person who is put in charge as a manager must be faithful. What about me? Have I been faithful? Well, it matters very little what you or anyone else thinks. I don't even trust my own judgment on this point. My conscience is clear. That isn't what matters. It is the Lord himself who will examine me and decide. So be careful not to jump to conclusions before the Lord returns as to whether or not someone is faithful. When the Lord comes, he will bring our deepest desires and secrets to light and reveal our private motives. Then God will give to everyone whatever praise he is due. Dear brothers and sisters, I have used Apollos and myself to illustrate what I've been saying. If you pay attention to the scriptures, you won't brag about one of your leaders at the expense of another. What makes you better than anyone else? What do you have that God hasn't given to you? And if all you have is from God, why boast as though you have accomplished something on your own? It's not about what you do. It's about whose you are. And now he comes and hits this other side. You think you have everything you need. You're already rich. Without us, you've already become kings. I wish you really were on your thrones already, for then we would be reigning with you. But sometimes I think God has put us apostles on display, like prisoners of war at the end of the parade, condemned to die. We've become a spectacle to the entire world, to people and angels alike. Our dedication to Christ makes us look like fools, but you are so wise. We are weak. You're so powerful. You are well thought of, and we are laughed at. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty, without enough clothes to keep us warm. We've endured beatings, and we have no homes of our own. We have worked wearily with our hands to earn our living. We bless those who curse us. We are patient with those who abuse us. We respond gently when evil things are said about us. Yet we're treated like the world's garbage, like everybody's trash, right up to the present moment. There is this tendency in Christian churches to move this direction, to move to this place where happy, happy, happy. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. This move into triumphalism that ignores the reality that everyone is going to face suffering. That it is not a matter of if you have suffering, you are not receiving God's grace. It's there on the wedding day. It's both. The great grace. And so this triumphalism, that's the term for it. People that just, oh yes, we're always going to win. We're going to come out on top. Nothing's going to go wrong for us. That's what it's called, triumphalism. And people that are thinking that way, anything bad that happens, it's your fault. Oh, God wouldn't let that happen. And it's all coming back to this, we've got the power. trying to bring it into that manageable where it's all under my control and I don't have to submit to the one whose judgment is greater than mine. I don't have to trust that he is going to work out these things that are beyond my ability to understand. Paul hits him right there, and all this mockery that he used. Oh yes, you've already become kings without us, and yet we're treated like garbage. Verse 14, I'm not writing these things to shame you, but to warn you as my beloved children. For even if you had 10,000 others to teach you about Christ, you have only one spiritual father. For I became your father in Christ Jesus when I preached the good news to you. So I ask you to follow my example and do as I do. This idea of the good news is not the happy, happy, happy. It's not the everything's fine, it's going to be fine, nothing bad's going to happen. That's not the good news. The good news is that regardless of what happens, God is going to see you through. That he has enough grace for every challenge that you face. And that through everything, he is going to bring himself and bring you with him into glory. So, Paul is dealing with them, and this whole thing is about the words. These words of power. Now we know from reading in Acts that wherever Paul went, things kind of got stirred up. And that words, those kind of words, have power to disturb people who think that they've got everything under control. To upset the human social order. Where people have the ones they want under their thumb, and they're getting the wealth and the recognition that they want. God's message is always going to disturb that way. So we've seen Paul doing that, but we also see that even there with God's people, Paul is going to speak those words of power, and it works on both sides. So when he's on that first missionary journey, when it's still saying Barnabas and Saul, even before they started calling him Paul and his name was mentioned first. They go to the island of Cyprus and they're going through, and this advisor of some kind, Elymas or Bar-Jesus, the magician who is with the governor of the island, starts trying to, it's like that worm tongue talking to Theoden. And Paul just knocks him blind with a word. That's a word of power. Acts chapter 13. Or when they get over into chapter 16, they've met Lydia and her family and worshiped down by the river, and they're going through the market, and this girl's following him. These men are servants of the Most High God. They're telling you the way of life. Does Paul want the demon-possessed girl being his PR person? No. Because all that does is builds up her credibility. So he casts out the demon. That's words of power. Galatians chapter 2, he tells this story about how when Peter came up to Antioch, that some folks had come along trying to do all this stuff. Oh, you've got to be a Jew to be acceptable to God. And Peter is there, and these ones that are saying this, and even Peter and Barnabas get carried away and start pulling back from their Gentile brothers because of this teaching. And Paul doesn't make any bones about it. He comes right at it and says he had to speak forcefully to Peter. Confront him to his face to say this is not right. Words of power. What does Paul say here at the end of chapter 4? I know some of you have become arrogant, thinking I will never visit you again, but I will come, and soon, if the Lord will let me. And then I'll find out whether these arrogant people are just big talkers or whether they really have God's power. For the kingdom of God is not just fancy talk. It is living by God's power. Which do you choose? Should I come with punishment and scolding, or should I come with quiet love and gentleness? My students at Smithville, there's 6 fifth grade classes. And thankfully, one of the other classes does have a man teacher, so I'm not the only one there. But it is amazing the different ways that the kids respond to the women versus the men. They're going to push the limits more with the men to see what the strength is. And so for this last week, we had 2 days where they had benchmark tests, and they had to sit and not move and be absolutely quiet for hours straight. Oh, whoever invented that does not understand anything about children and their needs. And so after they've had that, they really need some time to let some wiggles out, let some talking and noise, and just to really... And we do our best to make it available for them, but they still need to follow the rules. And so these 5th grade classes are waiting at the end of the day to go in for PE. And the 2 PE teachers, because it needs 2 teachers with that many classes going in at once. And they're calling for the kids to get at the right voice level where they can hear the instructions. And nothing is happening. And these 2 ladies they know what they're doing. They are really good. But the kids are just... Well, I bring out my loud voice. 5th grade! They get quiet. Is that what we want God to have to do with us? Do we have to have the words of power, or do we want that gentleness? It's easy for us to recognize God's power when it is in that terror, when it's at that high volume, when it's that swift kick in the pants that we sometimes need. But God's power is not any less when He comes and speaks to us in that gentle whisper. When He brings us into His arms and says, "Why are you doing this, my child? What are you really thinking about?" Just because it's done with gentleness and kindness and with grace does not mean it is any less powerful. So, in all of this whole thing back and forth about, are we moving and relating to God as this infinite, powerful, loving Creator, Redeemer, friend? Or are we treating Him just like one more way that we can manage to kind of get ourselves where we want? And if we are managing to keep ourselves together well enough, and anybody else, oh, look at them. Our way's better. In the middle of that, moving beyond that as just mere human thinking, mere human wisdom, into accepting God's way, to live by His Spirit and recognize that even though we're going through the same kinds of sufferings that people in the world face, that there is a power available to us that goes beyond anything we can understand. And that as we live out that power, the kingdom of heaven is not fancy talk. It's not about the quality of the performance. but it is living with God's power. And as evidenced by the way that the church is fractured up in the world, in denominations, and we don't fellowship with them, or when you say, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, aren't you acting like those who are not Christians? And so we're living like we don't really have God's power, like we are not children of the one true King. And so we still hold on to regret, and we listen to all those voices that are telling us who we are instead of listening to God's voice. What is the gospel? What does it mean to live in the kingdom of God? To leave behind the fancy talk and the posturing and to live knowing God directly, personally, to hear that gentle voice who brings us along and provides grace in every moment. Y'all ready? As I was finishing the last slides this morning, trying to capture some image things that might help bring this lesson home, the song that kept going through is, How Great is Our God, the name above all names, worthy of all praise. When we have that true vision of this God, breathing in His grace and breathing out His praise, when we get that picture, when we get that truth all the way down inside, everything else will change. Those struggles that we face, they'll be put into perspective. If God is for us, who could be against us? So what that this person is having more success in terms of the world's eyes than I am? I don't even trust my own judgment in this. All I have to be is faithful. God is the one who will judge. So, even if you feel like you're part of that parade and the world's just parading you as, look, they're going to get it at the end. I don't even know. We're going to see in the next chapter where Paul uses that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where he says that aroma, that fragrance that said of Christ, when we are living by that Spirit, to the world that smells like death. But for those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Let's embrace that gospel fully.